The phone call came on a Tuesday morning while I was still in my hospital bed, trying to figure out how I'd manage the stairs to my second-floor apartment with this new hip. My son Michael's voice carried that familiar mix of concern and determination that reminded me so much of his father. "Mom, you're coming to stay with us. No arguments." I'd raised Michael to be stubborn when it mattered, so I knew better than to fight him on this. Still, the thought of imposing on his marriage made my stomach twist. He'd only been married to Clara for 3 years, and I'd always tried to give them space to build their life together. But here I was, 68 years old, and suddenly dependent on others for the first time since my husband died. "It's just until you're back on your feet," Michael assured me, as he helped me out of his Honda that first afternoon. "Clara's excited to have you. She's been cleaning out the guest room all week." Their house in Maple Grove was one of those newer developments where all the lawns looked freshly painted and the mailboxes matched. It wasn't my style, but it was theirs, and I could see how proud Michael was when he pointed out the granite countertops and the 2-car garage. Clara appeared in the doorway wearing a floral apron and a smile that seemed just a little too bright. "Welcome home, Mom," she said, though something in her tone made it sound more like a question than a statement. The first few days passed in a blur of prescription medications and afternoon naps. I tried to be the perfect house guest, keeping my belongings in the guest room and offering to help with dishes whenever I could manage it. Clara would wave me away with a laugh, saying I needed to focus on healing. She'd bring me tea in the afternoon and ask about my physical therapy appointments. Everything seemed normal, or at least what I imagined normal should look like. But there were small things that nagged at me. The way Clara would stiffen when Michael kissed my cheek goodbye in the mornings. How she'd glance at her watch when I came downstairs for breakfast, as if I was interrupting something. The guest room was lovely, but it felt temporary in a way that made me wonder if I was reading too much into every interaction. Michael worked long hours at the insurance company, leaving early and coming home exhausted. I'd watch him collapse into his recliner after dinner, scrolling through his phone while Clara busied herself in the kitchen. Sometimes I'd catch her watching me from the corner of her eye, and I'd wonder what she was thinking. Did she resent having me there? Was I making things harder for their marriage? By the 3rd week, I started noticing changes in our routine. Clara stopped asking about my day, or mentioning the neighborhood book club she'd once invited me to join. Our conversations became shorter, more functional. She'd tell me about grocery store sales or mention that my laundry was done, but the warmth from those first days seemed to be evaporating. I tried to convince myself it was natural. Living with someone new, even family, required adjustment. Maybe Clara was just tired. Maybe I was being too sensitive. I'd spent 10 years living alone after my husband's death, and perhaps I'd forgotten how to navigate shared spaces with other people. One evening, I offered to cook dinner as a way to contribute something meaningful to the household. I'd always been proud of my pot roast, and I thought it might be nice to give Clara a break from kitchen duties. But when I mentioned it, she looked almost panicked. "Oh, that's not necessary," she said quickly. "I've already planned everything for the week. Besides, you should be resting." I backed down, but something in her reaction stayed with me. It wasn't just polite refusal. It felt like she was protecting her territory. I started paying more attention to the small details of our daily life, noticing patterns I'd previously dismissed. The way she'd serve Michael first at every meal, then me as an afterthought. How she'd clean around me rather than including me in household tasks. The subtle shift in her body language when I entered rooms where she and Michael were talking. Maybe I was overthinking everything. Maybe this was just how families worked when 3 adults tried to share one space. But lying in bed that night, listening to muffled voices from their bedroom down the hall, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was changing, and not in a way that boded well for any of us. The shift happened gradually, like winter creeping into fall. One morning I came downstairs to find only 2 place settings at the breakfast table. Clara glanced up from her coffee with what might have been surprise or maybe annoyance. "I thought you usually slept in," she said, not making any move to get me a plate. I mumbled something about being up early and fixed myself toast while they finished their Eggs Benedict. Michael was buried in his phone, scrolling through work emails, completely oblivious to the tension I could feel radiating from his wife. When he left for work, Clara immediately began clearing the table around me, her movements sharp and efficient. "There's cereal in the pantry," she said without looking at me. and fruit in the fridge. That afternoon, I found a small Tupperware container with my name written in black marker sitting on the second shelf of the refrigerator. Inside was a portion of what looked like last night's chicken casserole, the cheese congealed and the vegetables looking tired. I stared at it for a long moment, trying to understand what had changed. When had I stopped being included in regular meals? The containers became a daily occurrence. Each morning I'd find my designated portion waiting for me, usually leftovers from whatever they'd eaten the night before. Sometimes it was a reasonable serving, but often it felt like an afterthought. A single pork chop with a spoonful of mashed potatoes, half a sandwich with the crusts cut off, a small bowl of soup that had clearly been the bottom of the pot. I wanted to say something, but what exactly? Clara wasn't being openly cruel. She was feeding me after all. When Michael was around, she'd ask if I'd eaten well and mention how she'd saved me some of their dinner. To an outsider, it might have looked thoughtful, but I knew the difference between being cared for and being managed. The worst part was dinner time. I'd hear them in the dining room, talking and laughing while I sat alone in the kitchen reheating my container. Clara had stopped setting a place for me at the table weeks ago, claiming the microwave was easier for me to use. She'd pop her head in occasionally to ask if I needed anything, but it felt performative, like she was checking off a box on her caregiver duties. Michael never questioned why I wasn't joining them for meals. When I finally worked up the courage to mention it, he looked confused. "But Clara said you prefer eating earlier because of your medications," he said. "She's been so considerate about timing everything around your schedule." I wanted to tell him that wasn't true, that I'd never expressed any preference about meal times. But Clara had been so clever about it, creating a narrative that made her exclusion of me seem like accommodation. How do you argue with someone's kindness, even when it doesn't feel kind at all? The containers grew smaller. Some days I'd find just a few bites of meat and a roll from dinner. Other days, it would be a sad serving of vegetables with no protein at all. I started keeping crackers in my room and eating them when the hunger got too uncomfortable. I told myself Clara was probably just busy, that she didn't realize how little she was giving me. But then I started paying attention to their plates, when I glimpsed them through the dining room doorway. Michael's portions were generous, his favorite foods appearing regularly. Clara served herself reasonable amounts. Only my containers seemed to shrink week by week. I tried to contribute by offering to cook, or at least help with meal preparation. Each time, Clara would smile and wave me away. "You're recovering," she'd say. "Let me handle the kitchen." But I was recovering from hip surgery, not a stroke. I could chop vegetables and stir pots. I could set tables and load dishwashers. The forced helplessness felt more debilitating than my physical limitations ever had. One evening, I found a container with just a chicken bone and a small scoop of stuffing. I stood there holding it, trying to remember when I'd last felt so small. It wasn't about the food, not really. It was about being reduced to someone who could be fed scraps and expected to be grateful for them. That night, I lay in bed listening to my stomach growl, wondering how I'd become so invisible in my own son's house. I thought about my late husband, how he'd always made sure I had the best portion of everything, how he'd considered my comfort and preferences without being asked. The contrast felt like a physical ache. I started dreading mealtimes, knowing I'd find another inadequate container with my name on it, knowing I'd eat alone while they enjoyed each other's company in the next room, knowing that if I complained, I'd be painted as ungrateful or difficult. The worst part was Michael's obliviousness. He'd ask how I was feeling, whether I needed anything, if Clara was taking good care of me. And what could I say? That his wife was starving me slowly? That I felt like a burden being managed rather than a mother being loved? So I smiled and said Clara was wonderful, all while my dignity crumbled bit by bit with each small labeled container. The mornings became the hardest part. I'd wake up before dawn, listening to the house come alive around me. First Michael's alarm, then the shower running, then Clara's footsteps in the kitchen. They'd have coffee together, their voices low and intimate, talking about their day ahead. I'd lie there pretending to sleep, not wanting to interrupt their private time, but also not wanting to face another day of careful politeness and labeled containers. My hip was healing fine, according to Dr. Martinez, but I wasn't sleeping well, and I'd lost weight. At my 6-week follow-up, He asked if I was eating enough protein. I told him I was fine, but the truth was, I'd stopped looking forward to meals entirely. Food had become something to endure rather than enjoy. Clara started making comments that felt like tiny cuts. She'd mentioned to Michael how much easier it was when they were just the two of them, how she missed their quiet dinners together. She'd sigh about the extra laundry and cleaning, always careful to smile at me when she said it, as if we were sharing a private joke about the inconvenience of my existence. "Some people just need more attention than others," she said one afternoon while folding towels. I was sitting nearby, trying to help sort socks, but she kept rearranging everything I touched. I suppose that's what happens when you get older. I wanted to remind her that I was only 68, that I'd been living independently for a decade before my surgery, but something in her tone told me she wasn't really talking to me at all. She was talking to herself, justifying whatever she was feeling. The breaking point came on a Thursday night. I'd had a particularly good day at physical therapy, and I was feeling optimistic about my progress. I came home expecting to find my usual container, but there was nothing in the fridge with my name on it. I checked twice, moving things around, wondering if I'd missed it somehow. Clara was in the living room watching television with Michael. I stood in the kitchen doorway, unsure how to ask about dinner without sounding demanding. Finally, I cleared my throat. "I'm sorry to bother you, but I don't see anything in the fridge for tonight." Clara looked up with what seemed like genuine surprise. "Oh, I completely forgot. We ate at the new Italian place downtown. I didn't think you'd want to go out." She hadn't asked if I wanted to go out. She'd simply assumed I wouldn't. Or maybe she'd hoped I wouldn't. Michael looked uncomfortable, glancing between us. "There's sandwich stuff in the fridge," Clara added, turning back to her show. "And I think there's some soup in the pantry." I made myself a peanut butter sandwich and ate it standing at the kitchen counter, listening to them laugh at something on television. The sandwich tasted like cardboard, but it wasn't really about the food. It was about being forgotten, about being so irrelevant that my existence didn't factor into their dinner plans. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about my life before, when I had my own kitchen and my own routines, when I could eat what I wanted, when I wanted, without having to rely on someone else's charity. I thought about my friends from church, how they'd ask about my recovery and assume I was being well cared for. What would they think if they knew I was eating peanut butter sandwiches while my son and his wife went out for Italian food? The next day was worse. Clara seemed to have forgotten about dinner entirely. When I asked about it around 6 o'clock, she looked annoyed. "I'm sure there's something in the fridge," she said without looking up from her magazine. "You're an adult. You can figure it out." But the refrigerator was nearly empty. They'd apparently eaten the last of the leftovers for lunch. I found a can of soup in the pantry and heated it on the stove, trying not to think about how this had become my reality. My son was working late again, so it was just Clara and me in the house, and the silence felt suffocating. I started questioning everything. Had I been too dependent? Too needy? Maybe Clara was right to be frustrated with me. Maybe I really was overstaying my welcome. The doctor had said I was healing well, that I could probably manage on my own soon. But the thought of asking Michael to help me find my own place felt like admitting defeat. Over the next few days, I became hyper-aware of every slight, every moment of exclusion. Clara would mention plans they'd made for the weekend, always phrased as if I naturally wouldn't be included. She'd talk about grocery shopping without asking if I needed anything, then act surprised when I didn't have toiletries or snacks in my room. The worst was when her sister visited. Clara transformed into the perfect hostess, making elaborate meals and setting the dining room table with their wedding china. I could smell the roast beef and hear their laughter from my room. When I came down for water, Clara's sister looked at me with polite confusion. "Oh, this is Michael's mother," Clara explained, as if I was an unexpected guest, rather than someone who'd been living there for 2 months. "She's been staying with us temporarily." I ate crackers and cheese in my room that night, listening to them enjoy their feast downstairs. The temporary nature of my situation had never been clearer. I wasn't family anymore. I was a problem to be managed until I could be moved somewhere else. That's when I started to realize that my silence wasn't protecting anyone. It was slowly destroying me. The phone number came from an unlikely source. I was at the library, trying to get out of the house for a few hours, when I overheard 2 women talking about their elderly neighbor. One mentioned calling Adult Protective Services when she noticed the woman looked malnourished and confused. The phrase stuck with me all afternoon. That evening, I sat in my room with my laptop typing Elder Abuse Minnesota into Google. I'd always thought abuse meant being hit or locked away, but as I read through the state website, I saw words that made my chest tighten. Neglect, emotional abuse, isolation, withholding food. Each bullet point felt like someone had been watching my life for the past few months. I closed the laptop and tried to convince myself I was overreacting. Clara wasn't evil. She was just young and maybe overwhelmed by having an older person in her space. But then, I thought about the chicken bone in last week's container, about eating alone while they went out for dinner, about being introduced as a temporary guest to her sister. The next morning, I called the Minnesota Adult Abuse Reporting Center. My hands shook as I dialed, and I almost hung up 3 times before someone answered. Adult Protective Services, this is Janet. How can I help you? Her voice was calm and professional, not the stern authority figure I'd imagined. I stumbled through my explanation, feeling foolish as I described labeled containers and excluded dinners. But Janet listened without interrupting, asking careful questions that made me realize my situation was more serious than I'd admitted to myself. Have you documented any of this? She asked. I hadn't, but I started that day. I began taking photos of the containers with my phone, writing down dates and descriptions of what I'd been given. I noted the comments Clara made, the meals I'd missed, the times I'd been excluded from family activities. Seeing it all written down was sobering. The intake worker called me back 2 days later. She explained that they'd be sending investigators to do a welfare check, that I didn't need to be present during their initial visit. The investigation would be thorough but discreet. I wouldn't have to accuse Clara directly, at least not at first. I felt guilty and terrified in equal measure. What if I was wrong? What if this destroyed Michael's marriage over my own oversensitivity? But then I remembered the peanut butter sandwich dinners, and the way Clara's eyes went cold when Michael wasn't looking. The investigators arrived on a Tuesday morning while Clara was at her book club, and Michael was at work. I'd given them a key the day before, not wanting to be there when they searched the house. 2 women in plain clothes, carrying clipboards and cameras, documenting everything I'd described. They photographed the refrigerator, including the containers with my name on them. They measured the portions, noted the quality of the food, documented the difference between what was in the main refrigerator and what was designated for me. They examined my room, noting that I had no access to snacks or beverages, that everything had to be requested through Clara. One of the investigators, a woman named Sarah, called me that afternoon. We've seen enough to warrant a full investigation, she said. We'll be interviewing all parties involved, including your son and daughter-in-law. When Clara came home from book club, she found their business card tucked into the front door. I watched from my bedroom window as she stood on the porch, reading it over and over. Her face went through several expressions: confusion, alarm, then something that looked like fury. She called Michael immediately. I could hear her voice rising from downstairs, though I couldn't make out the words. When he came home an hour later, the house felt electric with tension. "Mom," he said, knocking on my door. "Can we talk?" I'd never seen him look so confused and hurt. He sat on the edge of my bed, the business card crumpled in his hand. "Someone called Adult Protective Services," he said. "They're investigating Clara for elder abuse. Do you know anything about this?" I'd rehearsed this moment, but facing my son's bewildered expression made my carefully planned words disappear. Instead, I told him the truth, about the containers, about eating alone, about feeling invisible in his house, about being forgotten and excluded, and treated like a burden instead of his mother. Michael's face went through the same progression Clara's had: confusion, alarm, then something darker. But his darkness was directed inward, at his own blindness. "Why didn't you tell me?" he asked. "I tried," I said softly. "But Clara had explanations for everything, and you were so busy, so tired when you got home. I didn't want to be more of a problem than I already was." He was quiet for a long time, staring at the business card. Finally, he looked up at me. "You're not a problem, Mom. You're my mother. And if Clara made you feel like a problem, then I failed you." The investigators interviewed us separately over the next few days. They were thorough and professional, asking about routines, meals, medical care, social interaction. They spoke to Michael about his awareness of my daily life, to Clara about her caregiving responsibilities, to me about my experiences in their home. Clara tried to control the narrative, explaining away every concern with reasonable-sounding excuses. But the investigators had done this before. They knew the difference between genuine caregiving challenges and deliberate neglect. The preliminary report was damning. It documented inadequate nutrition, social isolation, and emotional abuse. It recommended immediate intervention and ongoing monitoring. Most importantly, it validated what I'd been feeling for months, that my treatment had been wrong, that I deserved better, that speaking up had been the right thing to do. The mask came off slowly, then all at once. For the first day after the investigators left, Clara maintained her composure, speaking to me in the same politely distant tone she'd used for months. But I could see the cracks forming. She'd start to say something, then stop herself. She'd catch me looking at her, and her jaw would tighten. Michael was asking questions now, really looking at our daily routine for the first time. At dinner that night, he noticed I wasn't at the table. "Where's Mom eating?" he asked Clara. "She usually prefers the kitchen," Clara said, but her voice had lost its confident smoothness. "The lighting's better for her eyes." Michael frowned. "Since when?" "Mom, come eat with us." I joined them at the dining room table for the first time in weeks. The silence was deafening. Clara served herself and Michael generous portions of the lasagna, then seemed to remember I was there. She cut me a small square, barely enough for a child. "Is that all you're having, Mom?" Michael asked. I looked at my plate, then at Clara's. I guess I'm not very hungry. But Michael was paying attention now. He added more to my plate, offered me garlic bread, asked if I wanted salad. Clara's smile grew tighter with each gesture. After dinner, I heard them arguing in their bedroom. Michael's voice was low but intense, Clara's getting higher and more defensive. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone was clear. He was demanding answers she couldn't give. The next morning, Clara was different. The careful pleasantness was gone, replaced by something raw and angry. She slammed cabinet doors while making breakfast, muttered under her breath while cleaning. When Michael left for work, she turned on me. "I hope you're satisfied," she said. "You've ruined everything." I was so shocked to hear her real feelings that I didn't know how to respond. This was the Clara I'd suspected existed all along, but hearing it out loud was still jarring. "I didn't want to ruin anything," I said carefully. "I just wanted to be treated like family." "Family?" She laughed bitterly. "You're not my family. You're his mother, and I've been stuck taking care of you for months. Do you know how that feels? Having someone else's mother living in your house, judging everything you do." The honesty was brutal, but also clarifying. At least now I knew where I stood. Over the next few days, Clara's behavior became increasingly erratic. She'd be fine when Michael was around, then turn cold the moment he left. She started making comments about the investigation, about how I was an ungrateful liar who was trying to destroy her marriage. "You want to know about abuse?" she said one afternoon while I was trying to make tea. "Try having your privacy invaded by investigators because some bitter old woman can't handle not being the center of attention." I started avoiding the common areas when Michael wasn't home, but Clara would seek me out, finding excuses to come into my room or corner me in the hallway. She needed to vent her fury, and I was the only available target. The breaking point came when the investigators returned for their follow-up visit. Clara had been preparing for days, coaching Michael on what to say, cleaning the house obsessively. She'd stocked the refrigerator with proper food portions for me, as if she could retroactively fix months of neglect. But the investigators weren't easily fooled. They asked about the dramatic change in my food situation, about why I suddenly had full meals when I'd been living on scraps for weeks. Clara's explanations became more frantic, more elaborate. "She's been depressed," Clara told them. "She wasn't eating much, so I was giving her smaller portions. I thought it was better than wasting food." But they had my photos, my documentation, my testimony. They knew the difference between accommodating someone's appetite and systematically undernourishing them. After they left, Clara completely unraveled. She screamed at Michael about how unfair it all was, how she'd been trying her best, how I was vindictive and manipulative. She accused me of planning the whole thing. of being calculated and cruel. She's been documenting everything, Clara shouted. Taking pictures, writing things down. She's been plotting against me from the beginning. Michael tried to calm her down, but something had shifted in him too. He was seeing his wife clearly for the first time, and he didn't like what he saw. "If you were doing nothing wrong," he said quietly, "why are you so angry about being investigated?" That question broke something in Clara. She started crying, not the delicate tears of someone seeking sympathy, but the ugly, desperate sobs of someone whose world was falling apart. She begged Michael to understand, to take her side, to send me away so they could go back to normal, but we all knew there was no going back. The investigation had pulled back the curtain on our family dynamic, and what it revealed was ugly and unsustainable. The final straw came 3 days later. Clara had been drinking wine with dinner, more than usual, and she was feeling bold. She started talking about how difficult it was to have me in the house, how she'd never signed up to be a caregiver, how she resented being expected to take care of someone else's parent. "I married you," she said to Michael, pointing her glass at him. "Not your whole family. I shouldn't have to sacrifice my life because your mother can't take care of herself." Michael looked at her for a long moment, then stood up from the table. "Pack a bag," he said. "You're going to stay with your parents while we figure this out." Clara's face went white. "You can't be serious." "I'm completely serious. You need to think about what kind of person you want to be, and I need to think about what kind of marriage I want to have." She left that night, still protesting, still insisting she'd done nothing wrong, but her perfect facade was completely shattered, and we all knew it. The house felt different without Clara's presence. Not empty, but lighter somehow, as if we'd been holding our breath for months and could finally exhale. Michael moved through the rooms like he was rediscovering his own home, noticing things that had been hidden in plain sight. The first thing he did was clean out the refrigerator, throwing away the labeled containers and the segregated shelving system Clara had created. He stood there for a long time, staring at the evidence of my isolation, and I watched his shoulders shake with what might have been anger or grief. "I'm so sorry, Mom," he said without turning around. "I should have seen this. I should have protected you." We had dinner together that night, just the two of us, sitting across from each other at the dining room table like we'd done when he was young. The conversation was halting at first, both of us afraid to acknowledge how bad things had gotten. But gradually we found our rhythm again. "I kept telling myself Clara was just adjusting," Michael said, pushing his mashed potatoes around his plate. "That having an extra person in the house was stressful for her. I made excuses for everything. I wanted to comfort him, to tell him it wasn't his fault, but I also needed him to understand how alone I'd felt." "You were working so hard," I said, "and she was very good at making everything seem reasonable when you were around." He nodded slowly. "She told me you preferred eating alone. She said you were embarrassed about your medication schedule, that you didn't want to hold up our dinners. I believed her because I wanted to believe her." The Adult Protective Services investigation continued for another month. The caseworker, Sarah, visited regularly to check on my living situation and monitor my recovery. She was impressed by the immediate changes in my care and environment, but she also documented the pattern of abuse that had preceded them. "This is one of the more clear-cut cases I've seen," she told me during one of our meetings. "Emotional abuse often leaves fewer obvious traces than physical abuse, but your documentation was excellent. You probably saved yourself from months more of this treatment." I started gaining weight again, not just physically, but emotionally. I felt like myself for the first time since moving in. Michael and I developed new routines, cooking together, watching the evening news, playing cards after dinner. It was peaceful in a way I'd forgotten was possible. Clara called several times, trying to negotiate her return. She'd found a therapist, she claimed, and was working on her issues. She sent Michael long letters explaining her side of the story, how overwhelmed she'd been, how sorry she was for any misunderstandings. "She wants to have a family meeting," Michael told me one evening. "She thinks we can work through this with counseling." I left the decision up to him. This was his marriage, his choice to make. But I also made it clear that I wouldn't go back to living under Clara's authority, that my safety and dignity weren't negotiable. The meeting never happened. Clara's letters became less apologetic and more accusatory. She blamed me for breaking up her marriage, for turning her husband against her. She claimed I'd manipulated the investigation, that I was a master of playing the victim. Michael read them all, his face growing sadder with each one. She still doesn't understand what she did wrong, he said. She thinks this is all about hurt feelings and misunderstandings. The divorce papers were filed 3 months later. Clara contested them, demanding counseling and reconciliation attempts. But Michael had seen enough. The woman who could systematically starve his mother while maintaining a perfect facade was not someone he could trust with his future. I found my own apartment 6 months after the investigation began. Not because I was being pushed out, but because I was strong enough to live independently again. Michael helped me move, and we both cried a little as we arranged my furniture in my new living room. "You don't have to go," he said for the 10th time. "The house is yours for as long as you want it." But I wanted my own space again, my own kitchen, my own routines. I'd learned that independence wasn't just about physical capability. It was about having the power to make choices about your own life. Clara moved back to her parents' house in Wisconsin. I heard through Michael that she'd had what her family called a nervous breakdown, though I suspected it was more like a reckoning with her own behavior that she couldn't handle. She'd spent so long constructing a perfect image that confronting the ugliness beneath it was overwhelming. I didn't feel victorious about her collapse. If anything, I felt sorry for her. She'd wasted so much energy on cruelty when kindness would have been easier. She'd destroyed her own marriage, rather than simply treating me with basic human decency. A year later, I ran into her at the grocery store. She looked older, thinner, with none of the polished confidence she'd once carried. She saw me in the produce section and froze, her face cycling through emotions I couldn't read. "Hello, Clara," I said quietly. She nodded but didn't speak. We stood there for a moment, 2 women who'd shared a house and a terrible time, now just strangers buying vegetables. "I hope you're well," I said finally. She nodded again, then hurried away without a word. I finished my shopping and drove home to my small apartment, where I made myself a proper dinner and ate it at my own table. The silence was complete and perfect, filled with the kind of peace that comes from knowing you're exactly where you belong.